You can study history in a lot of different ways. You can look at strategic military battles that change the course of a nation and sometimes of the world. But I think if you look at the great trials of history, formal trials in which the issue was what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is a lie. We're drawn to these great trials that many times define the whole flow of life. We go way back in antiquity, and we see Socrates on trial before the citizens of Athens. Also, we look at Charles I as he was placed in jeopardy, a trial before the British Parliament. Some of us are familiar with the Nuremberg trials. And we look back in more modern times and we see the hearings that took place in the form of trials with the affirmation of the last two Supreme Court justices, with the hearings that took place in the Kennedy-Nixon era when the whole issue was whether or not they would stay in office. And we have lesser trials that riveted me many times. I remember the Ollie North trial. I couldn't leave my television set. It so engrossed everything I was about. We think of Patty Hearst. We think of O.J. Simpson. So we look at the whole sweep of history. We see so many things were decided in critical times by trial, formal legal trials. But ladies and gentlemen, there's one trial in history that stands well above all other trials, and that was the trial of Jesus of Nazareth. There you have in display throughout all of history a clear choice between what is right and what is wrong, what is of God and what is of man. It all came to focus right there, those 2,000 plus years ago, when Jesus was taken as a prisoner out of the communion time he instituted there, and he went to the garden. You know the story. The guards came representing Rome, dominating power, representing the Sadducees, that would be the Supreme Court, and representing the Pharisees, that would represent all the synagogues and the people. They all came with their military might and captured Jesus after he was betrayed with that infamous kiss of Judas. And they took him away to be tried. Now, a sidelight was Peter's warming himself by the fire, not following Jesus, that he has claimed the crow of the rooster, which reminded him of his threefold denial. And then you have other little innuendos playing in, but basically, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you have three different individuals inspired by God describing in somewhat thorough detail of what happened in the trial of Jesus of Nazareth. Actually, there was two trials. There was a Jewish trial and there was a Roman trial. The Jews charged him with blasphemy. What is that? It is when someone takes the form of God and pretends to be or claims to be God. That was blasphemy. In the Jewish court, blasphemy, if it were proved, the punishment was death by stoning. The other charge came from the Roman court and the Roman side, and the charge there was, we would call it a revolutionary, someone who was seeking to overthrow the government, tyranny. And the charge, if proven accurate by the Romans, the penalty was death by crucifixion. So we have these two trials. Let me move rapidly through the Jewish trial. They took Jesus, they took him first before Annas. Annas was the accepted high priest of the Jews. Annas dealt with him sort of a precursory way. And it was, by the way, almost everything about the trial of Jesus was illegal. Illegal by Jewish law. Dogmatic Jewish law. Annas, the high priest, examined him, and he asked him about his teachings and what he'd been teaching all over Israel. And Jesus answered by saying, "That's public knowledge. I've been doing this for 3.5 years. Where have you been? Everybody knows what I've been saying, what I've been doing, the signs, the miracles that are taking place. You're asking a question that everybody knows the answer to." So Annas took him to Caiaphas. Caiaphas was also called a high priest, but he was though a son-in-law of Annas, he was approved and had the Roman stamp of approval on him, and he presided over the Sanhedrin, which was the Supreme Court. So Annas talked with him, had no results. Caiaphas talked to him, and then he took him late at night, and they had a session of the Supreme Court, and in that session, Annas asked Jesus a question he could not help but answer, and he confessed that he was indeed the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. And therefore, he said, case closed. The person who's been accused had admitted he's guilty of the crime which we're charging with, case closed. And then we see he called another session of the Supreme Court, sometimes after 6 a.m. in the morning, double session, and the same charges went out, and then they said, look, we must take and have him killed, but there was a problem here. And the problem was simply this. The Jews had the authority to punish someone by death. The Romans had taken it away from them, so they had to have the Roman stamp before they could take his life. By the way, the verdict has already been prejudged. You read in John chapter 11, you have Caiaphas saying before all the powers that be, we must take him out, we must have him killed. And Caiaphas said, if we do not do that, it's interesting, read it sometime in John 11. He said, if we do not do that, we will lose our power. We must do it for the people. For the people. Or the Romans will dominate us more than they're dominating us now. So the verdict has already been rendered by the Chief Justice. The verdict had already been stated, and now they're going through the ritual and the formality of some kind of phony trial of Jesus. So they had to take him to Pilate. Now we move into the Roman phase of the trial. Pontius Pilate. Now let me tell you a secret up front. We think of Pontius Pilate, and we have, if you've studied the Bible at all kind of negative views of him. But before we get through today, this service, I hope and I pray that most of us will see maybe a little bit and maybe a whole lot of Pontius Pilate in you and in me. So listen, be careful. So all the Sanhedrin took Jesus before Pilate, and they called him out because they would not go into the praetorium, which was the palace that Pilate used when he was in Jerusalem. And they took him out, and look at John chapter 18, beginning with verse 28. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early, and they themselves did not enter into the praetorium, so that they would not be defiled, but might eat of the Passover. They were more interested in religious tradition and liturgy than they were the truth. We'll see that all the way through. Therefore Pilate went out to them and said, What action? Why do you come? What do you accuse this one that you bring to me? In verse 30, they answered and said to him, if this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you. In other words, they said, look, we've found him guilty. We bring him to you. If they were not guilty, we would not have brought him to you. In other words, what did they expect? They expected Pilate, representing Rome, the power that was in control, to just give a rubber stamp to their decision and to have Jesus executed. But Pilate didn't do it. And this just startled them. And then we see what happened. The Jews said to him, we are not permitted to put anyone to death to fulfill the word of Jesus which he spoke, signifying by what kind of death he was about to die. Now notice this. How easy it would have been if the Jews had the power to execute. There would simply be a stoning of Jesus, and that would be it. But remember the prophecy? He would hang on a tree. He'd be crucified. The Romans did that. The Jews didn't do that. Look how subtle God's plan and God's prophecy is fulfilled right here in this passage. And look at the next of it. Therefore, Pilate entered into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and said to him, are you the king of the Jews? Why did he ask that question? What was the Romans' concern? They didn't care about blasphemy. No, that's religious stuff. But they cared about revolution, and therefore that's what they were afraid of with Jesus. He said, are you a king? And Jesus answered, are you saying this of your own initiative, or do others tell you about me? Pilate answered, I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests delivered you to me. And what have you done? What have you done, Jesus? What are the charges? Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of the world. If my kingdom were of the world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm. Therefore Pilate said to him, so you are a king? Jesus answered, you say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born, for this I have come into the world. Listen to this, ladies and gentlemen. Jesus says, I came to the world to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. And then Pilate says, what is truth? Jesus says, I came to the world. My kingdom is not of this world. It is a spiritual kingdom. It is a different kind of kingdom. In other words, he's saying, I'm not in competition with Caesar and Roman domination. He said, my kingdom is not of this world. My kingdom is of truth, and I came here to speak of truth, and everyone who follows my truth, they are a part of my kingdom. And then Pilate says, well, what is truth? And if you read it carefully, Pilate turned and walked away. Isn't that something? What is truth? He just turned and walked away. That's a big question right here today. That's a big question on the docket, on the agenda of this world today. What is truth? A lot of people debate it. Let me give you a philosophical answer to that in single-syllable words. What is truth? If you say what is, that it is. If you say what is not, that it is not, that is truth. If you say what is and it is not, and you say what is not and it is, that is truth. There is a definition of truth that you really can't debate with in single-syllable words. So what is truth? In our world today, in our culture, that's still debated. And I'm sure when Pilate asked this question, he understood the context of that, because all the great philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Euripides, they all debated on what is really truth. And finally, they never could decide. And Plato, I'm paraphrasing him, said that he believed one day a God will come or a word will come, and it will be the universal foundation upon which truth can be decided. That was indeed Jesus Christ. What is truth? Still debated. Much of our world does not believe in objective truth. Where did this come from? From many different sources all through the ages. Primarily, I believe it came from Hegel. Hegel said, here's a thesis. In other words, this is true. But somebody else comes along and says, oh, no. And there's an antithesis, the opposite of that. And then you come, and here's a thesis, here's the antithesis, and here's a synthesis. You say, well, we've come together, that is truth. But no, here's another branch off. This is truth. Here's antithesis, and you have a synthesis. This goes on and on and on and on, and that's the reason we have in our culture the idea that there are no absolute truths. Now, if you don't understand that, the Democratic Party has a thesis, the Republican Party has an antithesis, then you say, let's get together and come with this, and there'll be another thesis, another antithesis, and then there'll be a synthesis, and therefore the debate is, there's no ultimate truth. What is truth? Isn't it interesting? Pilate asked that of Jesus when he was looking at truth itself, Jesus Christ. I am the way, the path, I am the truth, and I am the light and the life. He was looking truth in the face, and he missed it. He was looking at perfection, God's revelation of himself to the world, and Pilate missed it. It's interesting, so interesting to me that as you think of Jesus, you read all the scripture, you read all the extra biblical literature, and you do not find hardly any breath of someone who debates the question that whether or not Jesus lived indeed a perfect life. Look at the scripture. Jesus was baptized. God the Father affirms him and said, this is my beloved Son, whom I'm well pleased. Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration, Father speaks and says, no, it's not these two prophets. Jesus stands alone. God the Father affirmed the truth and the purity of Jesus. And you move all the way through, and you see his own apostles, his own friends said that they called him the righteous one. They called him the Lamb, the pure Lamb. They called him holy, the people who knew him best. And then we see, well, what about his enemies? There, when he was crucified, one of the soldiers who was executing said, surely this is the Son of God. Even Judas, when he realized what he'd done, he came and threw those coins back in the temple and said, I have truly betrayed innocent blood. And you go all the way through the annals and study what all the comments were said. Friends, enemies, gods, protagonists. And even here in this trial, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the only thing they could claim about him was that he said he was divine, the Messiah, the Son of God. And that was true. That was their complaint against him. So here we have Pilate say, well, what is truth? And he was looking at truth revealed to humanity right in the face. And that's something. Truth. And then we see that Pilate then has a decision to make. He's in a difficult place. Do you see it? His whole leadership was on thin ice. How did Pilate, who was an Italian, get to be in charge of Judea, a whole section that was conquered by Rome? It was because he married Claudia, who was a great niece of one of the Caesars. In other words, the last important decision Pilate made was when he said, I do. And when he said, I do, that's the smartest thing he ever did throughout his life. As you know, if you study him, by the way, just to get ahead of ourselves, about a year or two after this event with Jesus, when he was judge and jury in the Roman trial, he was thrown out of office. He was exiled to a remotest part of the earth and eventually took his own life. So here we see, though, Pilate has some tough decisions to make, and look how he handled it. Here we begin to see ourselves. First of all, when they came to him, he said, the Jews said to him, we're not permitted to put anyone to death. In other words, the first thing, he washed his hands. He said, I'm washing my hands with Jesus. This is your deal. You've accused him. I'm washing my hands. Then the next thing he did, he said, well, I'm going to be neutral in this. This is neutrality. Verse 33, therefore Pilate entered again and into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and said to him, here we have the Q&A. And there's verse 37. Then Pilate said to him, so you're a king. Then we have verse 38. He says, what is truth? And then when he had said this, he went again to the Jews and said to them, I find no fault in him. 3 times in this study, Pilate says he's innocent. I find no fault in him. 3 different times as he examined him in the Roman court. So they cried out again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. And then Pilate was very shrewd. He said, look, someone mentioned he's from Galilee. So, I'll tell you what, where is Herod? It's not my responsibility. You see, he's trying to lateral Jesus away. He did not want to make a decision. So they sent Jesus to Herod, who was the Jewish king, and Herod said, boy, I'm sure glad to see you. Do a little trick, perform something. This is the same Herod that beheaded John the Baptist, you remember, Herod Antipas. And Jesus did not do anything. He did not say anything. And finally, he put a purple robe on him and got rid of him. And so here is his strategy. He's saying, I'm not going to get involved. I'm going to take a neutral position for his Jesus. First of all, he said, it's not my problem. He washed his hands. And then he took a neutral position. He said, I'm going to let Herod have it. Then he had another idea. He said, there's a tradition that at Passover time, the people can release a criminal if they want to release them. So he said, I've got it. Barabbas is in prison. He's the most infamous prisoner we have. A revolutionary, a robber, a murderer. So he took Barabbas out and went to the crowd and said, who do you want me to release, Jesus or Barabbas? And they said, Barabbas. Pilate was stunned. He said, what do you want me to do with Jesus? Crucify him. Release Barabbas, crucify Jesus. Isn't that something? Can you imagine the surprise that took place when the guard came in and Barabbas, thinking he was going to be crucified, only to be set free? The cross for Barabbas had already been constructed. Jesus, in all probability, died on Barabbas's cross. Barabbas, more than anyone else, sees clearly that Jesus took his place on that cross. So that strategy of Pilate didn't work. He washed his hands saying, I don't want to have anything to do with him. He washed his hands as he tried to say, I'm going to take a neutral position about him. But the pressure continued to build. And then we see Barabbas having taken care of, been pushed to one side. And then we see compromise. Look at chapter 19 of John. Pilate then took Jesus and scourged him. By the way, scourging usually led to death. It was that severe. The whips, the bones, scourged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and put a purple robe on him. They began to come up to him and say, Hail, King of the Jews, and to give him some slaps in the face. Pilate came out again and said to them, Behold, I am bringing him out to you so that you may know that I find no guilt in him. And then Jesus came out, probably virtually unrecognizable. He was so beaten. It's amazing he could have stood. And Jesus came out, and Pilate said, Behold the man. Behold the man. Thinking now in his compromise, do you see it? they would see how Jesus had been totally beaten to a pulp and was bloody and without recognition. Certainly they would let up, but then they said, crucify him, crucify him. That doesn't satisfy. The compromise he offered, he washed his hands and said, look what's happened. No, crucify him, crucify him. And then we see the rest of the passage as strong as it could be. Verse 8, chapter 19, and therefore when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. And he entered into the praetorium again and said to Jesus, where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, do you not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and I have authority to crucify you? Jesus answered, verse 11, you would have no authority over me unless it was given you from above. Do you see what happened to the trial of Jesus? Do you see what happened really? Jesus was on trial before the Jewish law and Jesus on trial before the Roman law. But in the trial, suddenly the Jews and the Roman found themselves on the docket, not Jesus. So very interesting. And the result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, if you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes him out to be a king opposes Caesar. Verse 13, therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out, and he sat on the judgment seat, the bema at the place of the pavement, and in Hebrew, Balbatha. And when it was the day of preparation for the Passover, it was the 6th hour. And he said, behold your king, verse 15. So they cried out, away with him, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. And they handed him over to be crucified. Christ or Caesar? Nobody explained it to Pilate like that. We have no king but Caesar. A total lie by the Jews. They hated Caesar. They hated the Romans. But Pilate now had a tough choice to make, and several of the Gospels picture him washing his hands yet again. He was saying, hey, the blood is upon you. I'm innocent. I have found him innocent 3 times. I tried everything I could do to see that he could be set free. But now the blood is on you. He washed his hands. I am innocent, I am innocent, I am innocent. Do you see yourself anyway in Pilate? Do you? There are a lot of issues before America today. But I would say that 3 of the greatest issues that we have before us in this hour, they involve life, marriage, and gender. There they are. The number one moral issue we have before us today is the issue of abortion. Now, it's interesting to me that a lot of women who have gone through an abortion early in life when they didn't understand, they today are the most militant, anti-abortionist, and pro-life people we have in our land. Because they know the price that is paid. But the issue of life, the issue of abortion, is the holy grail of progressives and liberals in our society. It is the number one issue. They'll talk about the wall, they'll talk about the economy, they'll talk about everything else, but the one unnegotiable for the godless folks in America today is the issue of abortion. That's it. Everything else spins off that. Issue of life, marriage, we'll talk about that, issues off that another time. We'll talk about gender. We'll talk about that another time. But it is that issue of abortion that is a central moral problem in America today. How do you address that? What is your position on that? Let me tell you something. If the devil came back in flesh, in our society, he would either, I think, become an abortionist doctor working for Planned Parenthood, or he would run to be a nominee for president of the United States. I think that's how the devil would operate. Let me show you something. Slave owners and pro-choice, pro-abortionists are right together. There's really no difference in a slave owner and a pro-abortionist or a pro-choice person. They're exactly the same thing. You see, both of them have had their position approved by the Supreme Court. Dred Scott case. Those in the robes had the issue before the court as to whether or not a slave was property, or was it a fact that a slave was a human being. And the Supreme Court, another robed group, said a slave is not human, a slave is a piece of property, therefore the slave owner can do what they want to do with that slave. And that slave has no constitutional rights because it's property. Dred Scott decision. Roe v. Wade, another group of robed individuals, decided very clearly that that fetus, that life in a mother's womb, really was not a human being, does not have any constitutional rights. That life in the mother's womb can be taken away because it is the property of the mother, and the mother can make any choice she wants to make. The same ruling. Slave owners, pro-choice abortionists, have both their positions have been proved by the highest court in our land. Roe v. Wade's been in effect less than 50 years. Abortionists, legal abortion in other countries, Finland, Poland, been in effect about 80 years. Slavery was legitimized around the world for thousands of years. The issue that you saw there in the hearing of the last two recommendations to the Supreme Court, what do you think all that was about? One thing, ladies and gentlemen, abortion. Abortion, that's what that was about. Because the liberals know if that one thing becomes illegal, everything changes in every other cultural battle that we have today. The issue is life. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Liberty means nothing. Pursuit of happiness means nothing when there is not life and the sacredness of life in a mother's womb. It's one thing to be in a nation and a part of a country where children are offered as sacrifices and where they are offered on the altar of whatever which has happened throughout pagan history. That is one thing. But it's another thing to live in a society where the life is in the mother and the mother is the one who takes the gun and destroys that life. That's another thing entirely. Somebody said, well, how do we approach these issues? Many of us approach these basic issues just like Pilate did. Pilate said, it's not my concern. You handle this. I'm not involved in this. Then Pilate says, I'm going to be neutral in this. I'm not going to take sides. I'm going to try the Barabbas thing and the Herod thing. I'm just going to be neutral. Let me tell you something. As far as abortion is concerned and life is concerned, there's no neutrality. You say, well, it's all right in the first little bit trimester, but I'm against abortion 1 minute before the child is born. No, there's no place to compromise when it comes to life. But that's what we do. That's what we do. I'm not involved in this. I'm going to take a neutral position in this. Well, I'm going to compromise a little bit and say, well, abortion's all right if it's early on and. No. The choice comes down to all of us who are here, just like it did to Pilate. Christ or Caesar? Take the world's way or take the way of God? That's always the choice we make day by day by day. And many times it costs us. It is high risk to stand and speak and live the truth in love. Boy, that's a challenge for all of us. The importance of taking a stand. I don't know anything that has gripped me more in recent days than what happened in Dallas with the female police officer who thought she was in her apartment. All the circumstances of the trial, I do not know, and I have not studied, but she went in and she murdered a wonderful young man by accident. We don't know the whole story. The trial took place. She's pronounced guilty, a sentence. You can debate the sentence and all of that. I'm not into that. But what happened after that? The wonderful young man whom she had murdered, she says accidentally, and I think that's probably true, she had murdered his younger brother, who had not really spoken out. He was so hurt by his idol, his older brother, who was such a terrific young man, had been murdered, and he asked for permission to speak there in the courtroom in Dallas. And I want you to listen to what he said, and no one knew what he was going to say. Watch it. Watch it.
If you truly are sorry, I know I can speak for myself. I forgive you. And I know if you go to God and ask him, he will forgive you. And I don't think anyone could say it. Again, I'm speaking for myself, not even bad for my family. But I love you just like anyone else. And I'm not gonna say I hope you rot and die just like my brother did, but I personally want the best for you. And I wasn't gonna ever say this in front of my family or anyone, but I don't even want you to go to jail. I want the best for you. Because I know that's exactly what both of them would want you to do. And the best would be give your life to Christ. Again, I love you as a person. And I don't wish anything bad on you. I don't know if this is possible, but can I give her a hug, please? Please?
Yes.
Now, the rest of the story is, this is the judge. She also has the murderer there in her arms, and she is saying to her, believe in Christ, John 3:16, and gives her her Bible. The judge gives this lady the Bible. Now, as a result of this, oh my goodness, the ACLU, they want to disbar the judge. They say this is totally inappropriate. You can't do this in a secular court of law. And they're going through all kind of fire because in a moment of extremity, they stood for Christ and not for Caesar. And I thank God for that witness. The judge is unapologetically a born-again Christian. So is this 18-year-old brother of the deceased. Listen, folks. Listen. Jesus took hell for you and for me. We deserve hell. Jesus took hell for us. Therefore, the only thing left for us is heaven. Now, a lot of people wonder, how can God send anybody to hell, a God of love? God does not send anybody to hell, but God will not let any garbage into heaven. Therefore, as long as garbage is in anybody's life, they, by allowing that garbage to remain in their life, condemn themselves to hell, because that's the only other option, because garbage can never go into heaven. And those who leave garbage in their life, they will be burned up like that garbage is burned up. So what do? We go to I say this reverently, the garbage man, Jesus Christ. And he comes and takes all of that trash away from you and me and gives us the courage as we make a choice every single day in which you and I live. Whether not to wash our hands as Pilate did and say, well, I'm not involved in these issues. Or to wash our hands and say, I'm just going to be neutral about these three issues that are before us. Or we say, I'm going to compromise a little bit. Or we say, I'm not going the way of Caesar. I'm going the way of Christ. And have some of the courage that this fabulous judge demonstrated in a formal court of law. To God be the glory.